On a hot Saturday morning in May of 1978, just outside a small farming town in Dawson County, Nebraska, a 14-year-old boy named Eli Turner was seen doing something so strange that pickup trucks began slowing down on the gravel road just to watch. He was dragging a wooden chicken pen across 11 acres of cracked, gray ground that looked as if it had been dead for years. Inside the pen were 38 old laying hens, scratching, pecking, flapping their wings, and kicking up dust behind them. From the road, it looked ridiculous. A skinny boy in worn-out boots, pulling a rattling cage of chickens across land that most grown men had already given up on. By noon, 2 pickups had stopped. By 3 o'clock, half the feed store had heard about it. And by supper, the whole town had given Eli Turner a new name, Chicken Boy. At the co-op, one old farmer laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. But the loudest laugh came from Calvin Briggs, the owner of Briggs Seed and Supply. Calvin leaned against the counter, stirred his coffee, and said loud enough for every man in the room to hear, "Chickens don't fix dead ground. Fertilizer does." The men around him burst out laughing. Someone near the coffee pot added, "That boy's dragging breakfast across a graveyard," and the laughter started all over again. But Eli Turner never answered them. He did not shout back. He did not defend himself. He did not explain what he was doing. He just kept moving the chickens. 10 feet at a time, 1 day at a time. Across the deadest field in the county. Folks in Dawson County had a name for that patch of land. They called it the Dead 11. 11 acres behind the old Turner barn. The soil there was pale, hard, and cracked like broken pottery. In July, it gave off heat like the top of a stove. In spring rains, water slid across the surface instead of soaking in. During dry spells, even pigweed seemed to give up halfway. Eli's father, Thomas Turner, had tried to grow corn there 3 years in a row. The first year, the corn came up yellow. The second year, cutworms chewed through half of it. The third year, the plants barely made ears at all. After that, most people in town said the same thing. That ground is finished. But the Turner family did not have much ground left. They had 42 acres, an old barn, a tired pickup, a small tractor that smoked every time it started, and more bills than savings. Thomas Turner had died 2 years earlier in a tractor rollover while trying to pull a disc out of a wet low spot. After that, Eli's mother, Ruth, worked breakfast and dinner shifts at May's Diner in town. Eli went to school, did chores, fixed what he could, and tried to act older than 14. But people still saw him as a kid, a poor kid, a fatherless kid, a boy trying to do a man's work without money, without proper equipment, and without anyone important standing behind him. So when he started dragging chickens across the Dead 11, most people decided grief had finally made him foolish. But the idea had not started with Eli. It started with an old notebook he found in the tack room, wrapped in burlap and tucked behind a cracked horse collar. The notebook had belonged to his grandfather, Samuel Turner. Samuel had farmed that land before chemicals, before big tractors, before every problem came with a bag, a bill, and a salesman. Most of the pages were simple: rainfall, planting dates, frost warnings, seed saved, calves born. But near the back, Eli found one sentence underlined twice. "Dead ground is not dead. It is hungry ground nobody had the patience to feed." Eli read that line again and again. Under it, his grandfather had written about chickens. Not as pets, not as egg machines. As workers, they scratched crusted soil. They ate weed seeds. They picked larvae from manure. They spread their own droppings. They helped turn straw into dark matter. In the old days, Samuel wrote, chickens followed cattle and cleaned up what the bigger animals left behind. Eli did not understand all of it at first, but he understood one thing clearly. He could not afford Calvin Briggs fertilizer. He could not afford new equipment. He could not afford another failed year. But he had chickens, 38 old hens nobody wanted. Ruth Turner had almost sold them for a few dollars each. Eli asked her not to. He said, "Let me try something first." His mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father would have asked what the plan was." Eli held up the notebook. Grandpa already wrote one. So Eli built the chicken pen from scraps. The frame came from broken 2x4s behind the barn. The wire came from a bent hog panel. The wheels came off a dead push mower. He tied a rope to the front and made a small door in the back so he could move feed and water. It was ugly. It leaned to one side. The first time he pulled it, one wheel fell off. But by the 3rd week of May, it worked. Every morning before school, Eli dragged the pen a few yards across the dead 11. Every afternoon, he moved it again. The hens scratched the dirt, ate bugs, dropped manure, and spread the straw Eli tossed behind them. Then Eli raked the area lightly and covered it with old hay from the barn loft. From a distance, it looked like madness. A boy dragging chickens across land that could barely grow weeds. One afternoon, Calvin Briggs drove past in his green pickup and stopped by the fence. He watched Eli struggle with the rope. Then he called out, "Boy, you planning to grow corn or feathers?" Eli said nothing. Calvin laughed. "You want advice? Plow it under. Borrow money. Buy proper inputs. Farming ain't a children's game." Eli wiped sweat from his face. Then he pulled the chicken pen another few feet. That made Calvin laugh harder. By evening, everyone at the feed store knew. By the end of the week, boys at school were clucking whenever Eli walked past. Even some grown men started flapping their elbows when they saw him in town. Eli heard all of it. He just kept moving the chickens. The worst part was that, for a while, everyone seemed right. Nothing changed. The field stayed gray. The cracks stayed wide. The wind still lifted dust from the surface. The chickens scratched and pecked and flapped around in the little wooden pen. But the land did not suddenly turn black. It did not suddenly grow tall grass. It did not suddenly look alive. By June, the farms around Eli's place had neat green rows of corn pushing up from the ground. But the dead 11 looked like a patchwork mess of straw, chicken tracks, wire marks, and dry dirt. At the co-op one morning, Calvin Briggs stood with a coffee cup in his hand and said, "By July, those chickens will be fatter, and that field will still be dead." The men laughed, and even Ruth Turner began to worry. One evening, she stood at the edge of the field in her diner uniform, smelling faintly of coffee, fried potatoes, and dish soap. She watched Eli fill the chicken's water pan. Then she asked softly, "Are you sure, Eli?" He did not answer right away. He knelt down and pulled back a layer of straw. The soil underneath was still dry, but it was not as hot as the bare ground beside it. He picked up a small clump and broke it between his fingers. "It's changing," he said. Ruth looked at the gray field. She wanted to believe him. But belief did not pay taxes. And the county tax bill was already sitting on the kitchen table. One afternoon near the end of June, Calvin Briggs did more than stop by the fence. He got out of his truck. It was the first time he had stepped onto Turner land since Thomas Turner's funeral. Eli was tying a loose wheel back onto the chicken pen when he heard footsteps behind him. Calvin stood there with his hands on his hips, staring over the field like a man watching an accident happen in slow motion. "Eli," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I've been meaning to talk to you." Eli straightened up and wiped his hands on his pants. Calvin pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. It was an old soil test. "I had this ground tested for your father a few years back," Calvin said. "Low pH. Nitrogen almost gone. Organic matter under 1%. Do you know what that means?" Eli stayed quiet. "It means this ground can't feed a crop. Not because you're lazy, not because you aren't trying, because it's worn out." Calvin stepped closer. "I know you're trying to help your mother. I do. But those chickens aren't going to save this field. You need real fertilizer, real inputs, real money behind it." He paused before saying the next part. "I don't want to see you lose this place like your father almost did." Eli looked at him, not angry, just still. "Thank you for worrying," Eli said. Calvin waited, expecting more. But Eli said nothing else. At last, Calvin shook his head. "I'll leave a bag of fertilizer at the gate. No charge." Then he walked back to his truck and drove away. The next morning, Eli found the bag leaning against the fence. He never opened it. Eli did not believe the chickens were magic. His grandfather's notebook had taught him better than that. The chickens were only the beginning. Their manure fed the soil. Their claws broke the crust. Their beaks hunted grubs, beetles, and weed seeds. Their movement spread straw and droppings across every small patch they touched. After every move, Eli added old hay, dry leaves, spoiled corn husks, and a little manure from the barn. He never left the chickens in one place too long. That mattered. Too long, and they would strip the ground bare. Just long enough, and they would disturb it, feed it, and move on. Then Eli planted clover and rye in the treated strips. Not for harvest, for roots. The clover helped feed the soil. The rye held the ground in place. The mulch kept the sun from baking the field. Slowly, The dead 11 began to behave less like concrete and more like soil. Nobody driving by could see that. They saw chickens, they saw a poor boy, they saw foolishness. But under the straw, something small was beginning. Then the drought came. By the middle of July, the rain stopped. At first, nobody panicked. Nebraska farmers knew dry weather. But 1 week became 2. 2 became 4. The corn leaves curled tight in the afternoon heat. The south wind blew hot across the county. Clean-tilled fields cracked open. Men who had laughed at Eli now stood outside the co-op, staring up at an empty sky. Calvin Briggs still talked big. He told farmers to wait. He sold more product. He said the hybrids would hold. But the fields told a different story. Corn on the hilltops burned from the bottom up. Some fields tasseled too early. Some never pollinated right. Every day, more green turned gray. And then, for Eli, things got worse. One morning, he walked out to the field and found 3 hens dead inside the pen. The heat had taken them. The others stood with their wings drooping, panting in the heavy air. 2 nights later, a stray dog tore through one corner of the wire and killed 4 more. Eli stood in the field, hands shaking, looking down at the dead birds. They had been his workers, his machine, his fertilizer, and now they were dying too. That night, Ruth found him sitting alone in the barn with his grandfather's notebook open across his knees. He was not crying, but his eyes were red. "What if they're right?" he whispered. "What if I'm just making a fool of myself and ruining everything?" Ruth had no easy answer. The tax bill was still on the kitchen table. There were only $37 left in the coffee can under the sink. The next morning, Eli walked into the field before sunrise. The air was still and heavy. He went to one strip he had treated back in May and knelt down. He pulled back the straw. The soil underneath was not cracked. He pressed a finger into it. It gave. He dug a little deeper. Then he saw it. One earthworm. Just one. Wet, dark, and alive in the palm of his hand. Eli stared at it. His heart started beating hard. "The ground's alive," he whispered. He ran back to the house with the worm in a coffee can. Ruth was making toast before work. Eli set the can on the table. She looked inside. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her eyes filled. She pulled her son close and held him. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. Eli did not tell anyone else. But that morning, he dragged the chicken pen back into the field with new strength. By August, people started slowing down again when they passed the Turner place. But this time, they were not laughing as loudly. The dead 11 did not look dead anymore. It was not beautiful. It was not a miracle. But it was alive. The sorghum Eli had planted stood shorter than the neighbor's corn, but darker. The clover between the rows had not disappeared. The straw still shaded the soil. When Eli pushed his fingers underneath, the ground was warm, but not baked. Calvin Briggs came out one afternoon. He said he was just passing by, but he parked by the fence and watched Eli for several minutes before stepping into the field. Eli was checking the sorghum heads when Calvin walked over. Without asking, Calvin bent down, pushed aside some straw, and picked up a handful of soil. It was darker than he expected. It crumbled instead of breaking into hard plates. A beetle moved through it. Then a worm curled against his palm. Calvin frowned. "What did you put on this?" Eli looked at him. "Chickens." Calvin's face tightened. "I mean something real." Eli said, "Straw, clover, rye, old manure, and thyme." Calvin dropped the soil and brushed his hands together. "That won't be enough." Eli nodded once. "Maybe not." That bothered Calvin more than any argument would have. He had expected the boy to defend himself. He had expected pride. Instead, Eli sounded patient. Calvin stood there a moment longer, looking over the field. Then he said, "September will tell," and he walked back to his truck. By September, the whole county knew the drought had won. Some farmers chopped their corn for silage because there was no grain worth waiting for. Some left fields standing because combining them would cost more than the crop was worth. At May's diner, men talked in low voices. At church, prayers got longer. At the bank, the appointment book filled up. Ruth Turner said less each day. The tax bill was still unpaid. The tractor needed repairs. And even if Eli's field produced something, nobody knew whether it would be enough. Then harvest week came. Eli borrowed an old combine from a neighbor named Walt Mercer, a quiet man who had known his grandfather. Walt did not laugh. He simply handed Eli the key and said, "Bring it back with fuel in it." The first pass across the dead 11 was slow. Ruth stood by the fence with her arms crossed. Walt stood beside her. 2 pickup trucks stopped on the road. Then 3. Then 5. Before long, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread. The boy was harvesting the dead field. Calvin Briggs arrived too. He parked farther down the road, leaned against his truck door, and folded his arms. The old combine rattled and coughed black smoke. Eli sat in the cab with both hands tight on the wheel, his heart hammering in his chest. The first pass ended. The grain tank was not full, but it was not empty. That alone made people stop talking. Then came the second pass. Then the third. Sorghum rattled into the tank in a thin golden-brown stream. Men along the fence began looking at one another. Someone whispered, "That really came off the dead 11?" Another man shook his head. "Can't be." Pass after pass, the old combine moved through the field. Dust rose behind it. The sorghum heads disappeared into the header. Grain dropped into the tank. The field everyone had called dead was giving something back. Not a record crop, not a perfect crop, but a crop. In that year, that was enough to feel impossible. Ruth lifted one hand to her mouth. Walt Mercer gave a slow nod. And Calvin Briggs did not move. He only stood there, staring at the field with his jaw tight. The real silence came at the grain elevator. Every farmer in Dawson County trusted the scale there more than gossip. Numbers did not care who laughed. Numbers did not care who sold fertilizer. Numbers did not care how old a boy was. When Eli's truck rolled onto the scale, Calvin Briggs happened to be standing near the office with 2 other men. He saw the Turner truck. He saw Eli behind the wheel. And he saw the sorghum in the back. The elevator manager wrote down the weight. Then he looked again. Then he wrote the number once more. The room got quiet. The manager looked up from his clipboard. "This came off the dead 11?" Eli nodded. The manager did the math. It was not the highest yield in a normal year, but in that drought, it was one of the few profitable harvests on that side of the county. Enough to pay the tax bill, enough to buy seed, enough to keep the Turner place alive another year. Someone behind Calvin whispered, "How did dead ground produce?" For a long moment, nobody answered. Then Eli said quietly, "It wasn't dead, it was hungry." The room went still. Nobody clucked, nobody flapped their elbows, nobody called him chicken boy. Calvin Briggs stared at the scale ticket like it had personally insulted him. Then he folded his arms and looked away. For the first time all year, he had nothing to sell and nothing to say. 2 days later, Eli found 6 sacks stacked neatly outside the Turner barn. Cover crop seed, rye, clover, turnip, radish. There was no note, no signature. But Eli knew where they had come from. Ruth came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the sacks, then at her son. "Calvin?" Eli nodded. She looked toward town for a long moment. That his way of saying sorry? Eli shrugged. Maybe it's his way of not saying it. Ruth gave a small laugh. "Take the seed." So he did. The next spring, Eli planted more cover crops. He moved more chickens. He built a better pen. Then another one. By the time he was 16, farmers around the county were asking questions they used to laugh at. How long do you leave the birds on one spot? How much straw do you use? What seed mix are you planting? Do you put rye down before sorghum? How do you keep the ground covered? Eli answered most of them. Not because they deserved it, because the land did. Years later, nobody in Dawson County called those 11 acres the dead 11 anymore. They called it chicken ground. The name started as an insult. Then it became a joke. Then it became a landmark. People would say, "Turn left after chicken ground." Or, "That's where the Turner boy proved us all wrong." Eli grew older. He never became loud. He never became rich in the way Calvin Briggs understood wealth. But he kept the farm. He rebuilt the soil. He raised cattle, rotated pasture, planted sorghum, corn, clover, and small grains. And every spring, when the new chicks arrived, he pulled his grandfather's old notebook from the tack room and read the sentence written near the back. "Dead ground is not dead. It is hungry ground nobody had the patience to feed." Then he would walk out to the field. The same field people had laughed at. The same field that had saved his family. And he would open the little mobile pen. The chickens would step out, scratch the soil, and begin again. Many years after that drought, on a spring morning when the gravel road was lined with green grass, a pickup slowed beside the old Turner fence. Calvin Briggs sat in the passenger seat. He was older now. His hair had gone white. His shoulders had fallen a little. A young man was driving, maybe his grandson. When they reached Eli's field, Calvin raised one hand. "Stop here." The young man pulled over. They stepped out and stood by the fence. The field stretched before them, green and living, with dark soil showing beneath the cover. The young man whistled. "That's a good-looking piece of ground. Who farms this?" Calvin stayed quiet for a long time. Then he said, "People used to call it the Dead 11. He paused and cleared his throat. "Then a boy and a bunch of chickens taught us all a lesson." The young man frowned. "What lesson?" Calvin looked across the field. For the first time, a small, tired, honest smile crossed his face. "Ground doesn't die first," he said. "People's thinking does." Then he turned back toward the truck. "Come on," he said. "I'll tell you the whole story." They drove away, and the field stayed behind. Green, living, fed back to life. People had laughed because they saw a boy dragging chickens through dust. They saw poverty. They saw foolishness. They saw a child trying to farm without money. But Eli saw something else. He saw soil that had been taken from for too long. He saw life that needed to be fed before it could feed anyone back. And when the drought came, the truth rose from the ground. Not loudly, not all at once, but row by row, truckload by truckload, scale ticket by scale ticket. The whole county learned something that year. A field is not worthless just because it looks dead. A boy is not foolish just because grown men laugh. And sometimes, the thing everyone mocks in spring is the only thing still standing at harvest. They laughed when Eli Turner dragged chickens across dead ground. But when the harvest came, only his field produced. And nobody laughed anymore. Every morning that summer, Eli woke before the sun. The house was always quiet then. His mother would still be asleep for another hour before heading to May's diner. And the only sounds came from the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the wind pressing gently against the screen door. Eli would pull on his boots, take a biscuit from the counter, and step outside while the sky was still purple over the fields. He liked that hour best. Nobody was laughing before sunrise, no trucks slowed down, no boys from school clucked behind his back, no grown men at the co-op shook their heads and called him foolish. There was only the field, the chickens, and the work. He would carry water first, because the hens drank more in the heat. Then he would scatter cracked corn, check the wire, move the shade board, and look for tracks around the pen. After the dog killed 4 hens, Eli never trusted the night again. Then he would take the rope in both hands and lean his weight into it. The chicken pen would groan, catch on a clod, then lurch forward. The hens would complain, flap, settle, and begin scratching again. 10 feet, sometimes 12, sometimes only 6 if the ground was rough. That was how Eli began to measure hope. Not in acres, not in dollars, in feet. At school, things got worse before they got better. One boy drew a chicken on the blackboard before math class and wrote Eli's name under it. Another left a feather inside his locker. During lunch, 2 older boys sat across from him and made clucking noises until the teacher looked over. Eli did not fight them. He had promised his mother he would not, but that did not mean it did not hurt. He carried the hurt home with his books, set it down beside the barn, and went back to work. One evening, Ruth found him washing dirt from his hands at the pump. His knuckles were cracked. His palms were blistered from the rope. She took his hands in hers and turned them over. "You're 14, she said softly. Eli looked away. "I know. You don't have to save all of this by yourself." He stared toward the field. "If I don't try, we lose it anyway." Ruth had no answer for that. Because it was true. The bank had already called twice that spring. The county taxman had sent a second notice, and though nobody said it out loud, both mother and son knew that one more bad year could mean an auction sign at the end of the lane. That was the fear Eli never told anyone. Not the laughter. Not the name Chicken Boy, not Calvin Briggs. The real fear was seeing strangers walk through his father's barn, picking up tools, turning them over, asking what they were worth. The real fear was hearing an auctioneer sell the tractor his father had died, trying to keep running. So Eli kept pulling the rope, and under the straw, the field kept changing. At first, the changes were so small that only Eli noticed them. A patch of clover where nothing green had held before. A softer strip under the mulch after a hard rain. A smell in the soil that had not been there in years. Not dust, not sour clay. Something darker, something alive. One morning, a meadowlark landed on a fence post near the dead 11 and sang while Eli worked. He stopped and listened. It was the first bird he had seen there all summer, besides the chickens. 2 days later, he found beetles under the straw. Then another worm, then more. He marked those spots with little pieces of broken lath from the barn, though he did not know exactly why. Maybe he just wanted proof for himself. Maybe he was afraid that if he did not mark it, he would wake up one morning and discover he had imagined the whole thing. Calvin Briggs noticed the lath markers when he drove past. At first, he thought the boy had finally lost his mind. Then one afternoon, after closing the store, Calvin drove out alone. He parked a quarter-mile down the road where nobody at the co-op could see him. He got out, walked along the ditch, and stood at the edge of the Turner field. He did not step inside. Not then. He only looked. The field bothered him. It was not supposed to be working. Calvin had built his whole life on certainty. He knew inputs. He knew numbers. He knew seed catalogs, fertilizer rates, credit terms, and yield promises. He knew what farmers needed before they admitted they needed it. And he knew dead ground when he saw it. At least, he thought he did. Years earlier, he had stood in almost that same spot with Thomas Turner, Eli's father. Thomas had held a soil test in one hand and a bank notice in the other. Calvin had told him the truth as he understood it. More fertilizer, better seed, more borrowed money to do it right. Thomas had nodded, but his eyes had looked tired. 3 months later, Thomas was gone. Calvin never told anyone this, but sometimes he wondered whether he had helped the man or pushed him deeper. That was why Eli bothered him. Not because the boy was foolish, because if the boy was right, then Calvin had been wrong about more than soil. By late August, the county was tired. The drought had a way of aging men. Faces looked harder at the diner. Conversations got shorter at the feed store. Farm wives stood longer in grocery aisles, counting coins before putting flour or coffee in their baskets. The fields had stopped looking hopeful. Some had the brittle color of old paper. Some smelled dry when the wind crossed them. Everywhere, men checked the sky and pretended not to be afraid. But out behind the Turner barn, the dead 11 kept holding on. It was not lush. It was not tall enough to brag about, but it had color. That color became the talk of the road. At first, people said it must be a trick of the light. Then they said the low ground must have caught more moisture. Then they said sorghum always held better than corn. Then they said Eli had probably used the free fertilizer Calvin left at the gate. But Ruth knew the bag had never been opened. It still sat in the shed, dusty and untouched. On the morning Walt Mercer came to lend the combine, he did not make much of an entrance. He simply drove his old International down the Turner lane, climbed out slowly, and looked toward the field. Walt was 71, narrow as a fence rail, with hands that seemed permanently shaped around tools. He had known Samuel Turner. He had known Thomas. And unlike most men in the county, Walt had never laughed at Eli. He walked to the edge of the field, bent down, and pushed his fingers into the soil beneath the straw. Then he stood up and looked at the boy. "You did more than grow a crop," Walt said. Eli waited. Walt brushed dirt from his hand. "You got the ground to forgive you." That sentence stayed with Eli all through harvest. When the combine started, it sounded like it might come apart. The belt squealed. The engine coughed. Dust rose around the cab and made Eli's eyes water. He was too young to be trusted with a machine like that by most standards. But Walt stood on the platform for the first round, one hand on the rail, saying little. "Keep her slow. Don't crowd the header. Listen to the cylinder." Eli listened. He had spent his whole life listening. To old machines. To his mother moving quietly at night. To men laughing when they thought he could not hear. To the field when it cracked, softened, and began to breathe again. The first strip cut clean. The sorghum heads fed into the machine. The grain began to rattle into the tank. At the fence, the crowd shifted. Nobody had expected much. Some had come to witness failure. Some had come because they felt guilty for laughing. Some had come because news travels fast in a dry county when one dead field starts turning out grain. Ruth stood with both hands clasped under her chin. She had told herself not to hope too much. Hope was dangerous when bills were real. But when that first stream of grain appeared, her shoulders began to shake. Walt saw it and looked away, giving her privacy. Calvin saw it too. He looked at Ruth, then at Eli, then at the field. For the first time, the story stopped being about chickens. It was about a woman trying not to lose the last place her husband had loved. It was about a boy who had carried a man's burden because nobody else was there to pick it up. The crowd grew quiet as the combine made another pass. Then another. The grain tank filled slowly. But it filled. When they unloaded into the truck, the sound of sorghum hitting the metal bed seemed louder than it should have. A dry, steady, beautiful sound. Like coins. Like rain. Like an answer. One man who had clucked at Eli in town removed his cap. Another stared at the ground. A third muttered, "Well, I'll be." Calvin said nothing. But when the second truckload came off the field, his face changed. It was not shame exactly, not yet. It was the look of a man whose world had developed a crack. At the grain elevator, the silence was even heavier. Usually harvest brought noise. Engines idling, men laughing, augers running. Coffee cups tapping on counters. But that afternoon, when the Turner truck pulled in, conversations thinned out until almost everyone was pretending not to watch. The scale operator, Harold Meeks, had worked that elevator for 26 years. He knew every truck, every farm, every field nickname. When Eli rolled forward, Harold leaned out the office door. "That from your south piece?" he asked. Eli swallowed. "The dead 11. Harold blinked. Then he motioned him onto the scale. The truck settled. The needle moved. Harold wrote the number down. Then he frowned and checked the tare weight from the empty run. He did the subtraction once, then again. Then he took off his glasses, wiped them, and did it a third time. The men inside the office stopped talking completely. Harold finally looked through the window at Eli. "Boy," he said, "you sure this all came off that 11?" Eli nodded. "Yes, sir." Harold turned the paper around and pushed it across the counter. The yield was not impossible in a normal year. But this was not a normal year. On ground everyone had called dead. In a drought that had burned stronger farms, Eli Turner had harvested enough to make a profit. Enough to pay the tax, enough to buy seed, enough to keep the bank away for one more season. And sometimes one more season is all a farm needs to survive. Calvin picked up the scale ticket without asking. He read it, his thumb pressed into the paper. For a second, nobody breathed. Then one of the farmers near the door whispered, "Chicken Boy did it." Nobody laughed at the name this time. Calvin set the ticket down carefully. He looked at Eli. There were a dozen things he could have said. That sorghum was drought-tolerant. That the field was small. That 1 year proved nothing. That luck had something to do with it. All of those things had some truth in them. But none of them were the truth that mattered. So Calvin said nothing. And Eli, who had waited all year to be believed, did not demand an apology. He only folded the scale ticket and put it in his shirt pocket. That evening, Ruth paid the tax bill. She drove to the county office in her diner uniform, with Eli sitting beside her in the truck. The woman behind the desk stamped the paper and slid the receipt back. Ruth held it for a moment longer than necessary. Outside, in the parking lot, she pressed the receipt against her chest. Then she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the tired cry of someone who had been holding a roof up with both hands and finally felt one beam settle back into place. Eli stood beside her, unsure what to do. Then Ruth pulled him close. "You saved your father's farm," she whispered. Eli looked down. "No," he said. "Grandpa helped." Ruth smiled through tears. "And you listened." The 6 sacks of cover crop seed appeared 2 mornings later. Eli found them before breakfast. Rye, clover, turnip, radish. Stacked neat and square by the barn door. No note, no signature. But one corner of each sack carried the stamp of Briggs Seed and Supply. Eli stood there a long time. He did not feel victorious. Not the way he had imagined. He felt older. He felt tired. And strangely, he felt sorry for Calvin. Because the man had not only been proven wrong in front of others, he had been forced to face the possibility that a boy with no money, old hens, straw, patience, and a dead man's notebook had understood something his store could not sell. Ruth came out behind him. She saw the sacks and let out a small breath. "Take them," she said. Eli nodded. "I will." Then, after a pause, he added, "But I'm still not opening that fertilizer bag." Ruth laughed for the first time in weeks. A real laugh. Light and brief and alive. The next spring, the Turner farm looked different. Not rich, not new. Still patched, still poor, but awake. Eli built a second chicken pen, this one straighter than the first. He used better wheels, stronger wire, and a small sheet metal roof for shade. He divided the field into strips with stakes and twine. He planted cover crops before cash crops. He kept a notebook of his own. Rainfall, chicken moves, soil smell, worm counts, planting dates, yield, mistakes, especially mistakes, because Samuel Turner's notebook had taught him that farming was not remembering only what worked. It was remembering why something failed, so the land did not have to suffer the same lesson twice. By the time Eli was 16, farmers began stopping at the Turner gate. At first, they pretended they were not asking for advice. They said they were just curious. They said their wives wanted chickens. They said they had a wet corner they might experiment with. But eventually, pride wore down. One man asked, "How long do you leave them birds in one place?" Another asked, "You think rye would work on sandy ground?" Another said, "My back 40 crusts over after every rain. What's your granddad write about that?" Eli answered what he could. Sometimes he did not know. When he did not know, he said so. That made people trust him more. Calvin Briggs came by less often. But every now and then, Eli would find something at the gate. A torn bag of seed that could not be sold. A cracked scoop shovel. A stack of old burlap sacks. Once, a used soil probe with a wooden handle. Never a note. Never an apology. But Eli accepted each thing. Not because it erased the laughter. It did not. But because bitterness was another way to poison ground. And Eli had spent too much of his life learning how to bring dead things back. Years turned. The dead 11 became darker. Then greener. Then dependable. The county changed too. Men who had once bragged about clean fields started leaving residue after harvest. A few planted cover crops. Some tried chickens behind cattle. Others at least stopped laughing before asking questions. Not everyone changed. Some never do. But enough did that the story spread. People began telling it at the diner, at the elevator, at church suppers, at county fairs. The details changed depending on who told it. Some said Eli had used 50 chickens. Some said 100. Some said Calvin Briggs had fallen to his knees in the field and begged forgiveness, which was not true. Some said the dead 11 out-yielded every farm in the county, which was also not true. The truth was quieter. And better. A poor boy had taken damaged land, used what he had, endured laughter, and kept going long enough for the soil to answer. Years later, when Eli was a grown man, a reporter from a small agricultural paper came to interview him. She asked if he considered himself a pioneer. Eli laughed at that. He was standing beside the same barn, now repaired but still old. Behind him, chickens moved through a mobile pen in a field that shimmered green under spring light. "No," he said. "I just listened to people who were dead before I was born." The reporter asked what he meant. Eli went inside and brought out Samuel Turner's notebook. The pages were brittle now. The pencil marks had faded. But the sentence remained. Dead ground is not dead. It is hungry ground nobody had the patience to feed. The reporter copied the line. Then she asked, "And what did you learn from all this?" Eli looked toward the field. He thought of his father, his mother at the diner, the boys clucking at school, Calvin's green pickup by the fence, the first worm in the coffee can, the sound of grain hitting the truck bed. Then he said, "Most folks want land to prove itself before they take care of it. But land usually works the other way. You take care of it first, then, years later, it tells the truth about you." The article ran in a small paper and did not make Eli famous. He did not want fame. But farmers clipped it out and pinned it in machine sheds. Ruth kept one copy in the kitchen drawer. Calvin Briggs kept one too, though nobody knew that until after he died. They found it folded inside his old desk at Briggs Seed and Supply. Across the top, in Calvin's handwriting, were 5 words. The boy was right. By then, Dawson County had long stopped saying dead 11. They called it chicken ground. Children who had never seen the field dead grew up thinking that was just its proper name. They did not know it had once been an insult. They did not know grown men had laughed at a fatherless boy. They only knew that the soil there was dark, the grass came early, and old Eli Turner still moved chickens across it every spring. One morning many years later, Eli stood at the fence with his own son, Samuel, named after the grandfather whose notebook had started it all. The boy was about the same age Eli had been back then. He watched the chickens scratch beneath the mobile pen and asked, "Dad, did people really laugh at you?" Eli smiled. "Oh yes. Did it make you mad?" "For a while." What made you stop being mad? Eli leaned on the fence. The field. His son frowned. Eli pointed toward the ground. Anger doesn't build soil. Work does. The boy thought about that. Then he asked, "What if they laugh at me someday?" Eli looked at him. "Then make sure you're doing something worth laughing at." The boy did not understand, not yet, but someday he would, because every family farm has two kinds of inheritance. There is the kind written on paper, acres, deeds, equipment, names on tax records, and then there is the kind written into a person, patience, stubbornness, mercy, the ability to stand in a field while the whole county laughs and keep pulling the rope anyway. That was what Eli Turner inherited, and that was what he passed on. The field stayed behind them, green and quiet. The chickens scratched, the soil breathed. And somewhere under the straw, unseen by anyone driving past, the small workers of the earth kept moving through the dark. Years before, people had looked at that same ground and seen nothing but failure. They had seen cracked dirt. They had seen poverty. They had seen a boy too young to know better. But Eli had seen hunger. And hunger can be answered. Not with pride, not with laughter, not with a bag someone sells you because he thinks he knows your land better than you do, but with attention, with patience, with small daily acts nobody applauds, a bucket of water before sunrise, a pen moved 10 feet, a handful of straw, a seed planted for roots instead of money, a boy who refuses to quit before the soil has a chance to speak. That is why the story lasted. Not because chickens saved a field all by themselves. They did not. Not because Eli was smarter than every farmer in Dawson County. He was not. The story lasted because everyone in that county knew what it felt like to be dismissed. Old people knew. Poor people knew. Quiet people knew. People with worn-out tools, small farms, patched coats, old tractors, and ideas that did not come from a salesman knew. They understood that sometimes the world calls a thing dead when it is only tired. Sometimes it calls a person foolish when he is only early. And sometimes it laughs at the very thing that will later save it. They laughed when Eli Turner dragged chickens across dead ground. They laughed when the dust rose behind him. They laughed when the boys at school clucked. They laughed when Calvin Briggs said fertilizer did what chickens never could. But the field was listening. The soil was changing. The roots were holding. The worms were returning, and when the drought came, the laughter had nowhere left to stand. By harvest, the proof did not come as a speech. It came in grain. It came in a scale ticket. It came in a tax receipt stamped paid. It came in 6 unsigned sacks of seed left outside a barn. It came in a new name spoken across the county, Chicken Ground. And every spring after that, when Eli opened the mobile pen and the hens stepped into the field, scratching and pecking like nothing important had ever happened there, he would remember the lesson his grandfather had left behind. Dead ground is not dead. A quiet boy is not empty. An old way is not worthless. And the truth does not always arrive when people demand it. Sometimes the truth comes late, after the laughter, after the drought, after the work no one respected. Sometimes the truth waits until harvest. And when it finally rises from the ground, even the loudest men in town have nothing left to say.